Well, hello again, everybody, and now we are going to move on to a discussion of puberty. So we are going to start off just going over some of the basics, some things that you might know, and some things you might not know. We're going to talk about males and females separately because they are so different in this regard, at least. We're going to go over some new findings and then talk about what happens when puberty is off a bit. So, first of all, you might not know that you grow. Boys, on average, when they're in puberty, grow about 4.1 inches a year, and girls grow about 3.5 inches a year, so about a half an inch different. But they begin at different times. So, as you can see from these two graphs, the graph on the left is cumulative height. So, this means how tall you are over how old you are. Girls, the height spurt in puberty starts at 10 to 11 or so. And so this period of time here from 11 to 13-ish is the only time in the lifespan that girls are on average taller than boys. And we can see that girls plateau off after that and boys plateau off a little bit later, but still higher. And we can see over here, this is growth rate. And when you are very young, you're growing incredibly fast. And then quickly, by the time you are 1, you are growing not as fast and actually about as fast as you grew during puberty. And so that you can see that growth spurt, that spike right there for girls and boys. For females, the onset of menstruation is called menarche, but many people think that that is actually when puberty begins, but it's not. We're going to talk about when it begins in a lot more detail in a little while. What happens is it begins when there is secretions from the pituitary gland, and that causes the body to eventually lead to the ability to procreate. But it's a longer process. Nonetheless, menarche is the most obvious sign of puberty in girls. It begins at different times, though, as you can see from this table on the screen. Those in poor and developing countries have menstruation later. Those in wealthier parts of countries earlier, so it's both across countries and within the country. So you can see here in South Africa, for example, the well-off people start earlier than the poor people, and that's how it is across the board. The more well-off you are, the earlier you start it, even if there are also these changes or these differences between countries, if you follow me there. And it seems that this nourishment and health factor is big, but also is the proportion of fat to muscle. This is why athletes, some with a low percentage of body fat, might actually begin menarche later and sometimes can stop menstruating at all. And conversely, obesity can lead to menarche sooner. And we will talk about that again in the couple slides from now. But the point being that it is both different within countries and across countries, and that nourishment, health play big roles here. And there have been big changes, we'll talk about them more, but in the last 100 years, 1900 menstruation began around 14 or 15, and today it's 11 or 12. So there have been some big differences happening. In males, though, there's a different timeline here. We can see that for girls, we have everything starting, at least on this, everything in this chart, starting by 11 to 11 and a half. For boys, 11, nothing, 11 and a half, nothing. Boys are substantially later than girls, and also it lasts longer. Girls are done by around 14 or so. Boys still have most of their time in puberty left following that. The first ejaculation, which is the only thing that's relatively close to menarche, is called spermarche. That generally is around age 13 or so, but it's not as well discussed for boys than girls, in part because it is more inherently sexual, but also because they don't need as much help with it as girls do, rightfully so. Another thing that you might not know is you get awkward. So unlike in infancy, when you're growing quickly, this time you know it. And historically, this was a bigger issue for girls. in particular the negativity associated with menstruation. There's been a stigma against it for generations and hundreds of years. In particular, your book puts it as cramps and, quote, messiness. That's your book's words. But nonetheless, now it's much more accepted. And I actually think this might be one case where TV commercials might actually be helping in some way. If you see certain TV commercials about tampons, they're women dancing around all happy and everything. And now, because I'm not just saying just because of TV commercials, but in part, I think that could play a role. But because of that, now the onset of menstruation is actually associated with higher self-esteem and a rise in status in girls. However, there are bad things as well. There's increases in fatty tissue, the enlargement of the hips and the butt, which is not in line with many of the messages we receive from the media. Boys, on the other hand, are a little bit different because they don't need as much assistance. Like we said in the last slide, few of them actually share spermarchy, in part, again, because of the inherently sexual nature of it. So those are just some of the basics. Now let's move to what I think of as something that's fascinating in new developing. And this comes to changes in puberty. The information here, most of it I got from this book that you can see on the slide. It's called The New Puberty. Very interesting book. If you're interested in it, I would highly recommend it. An MD and a PhD combined to write this up. And it is about the changes that are going on in puberty for girls. So we are going to focus on girls here because there's more change, but let's talk about boys first. We've already said that boys experience puberty later than girls, so it begins for boys, it could begin around 9, but somewhere between 9 and 14. And remember that is not full-on puberty at age 9, it's just the beginnings of it. Now, there is some evidence that puberty is occurring earlier in boys than in past years, but it's not definitive. With girls, it is definite that they are, on average, going through menstruation earlier. And in part, boys' biology is different than girls, of course, so the environmental triggers are just different. So, for example, obesity can actually spur puberty in girls, but it might delay it in boys, in part because of the same increase in estrogen that obesity causes. So obesity leads to more estrogen, and that can actually delay puberty in boys, whereas it increases it in girls. Okay, so let's get more into girls in detail here. We know a growing number of girls are entering puberty earlier, long before they are socially and emotionally ready for this change. And it's especially difficult for people going through puberty earlier and earlier because even the people who are going through it at the, quote, right, end quote, time are having problems, right? Even people who are as emotionally mature as you could be for a 13 or 14-year-old still have problems. So the NIH says that puberty typically begins between age 8 and age 13. And one generation ago, less than 5% of the population started before age 8, and it's now doubled. So now about 10% of all people go through puberty earlier than age 8. By age 7, about 10% of white girls, 25% of black girls, and 15% of Hispanic girls have undergone the starts of puberty. And by age 8, it's 18% of white girls, 43% of black girls, and 31% of Hispanic girls. Now, while it started earlier, the way that it begins hasn't changed. The first signs of puberty are breast development, then armpit and pubic hair, then acne, then the growth spurt, then menstruation. It's breast development, armpit and pubic hair, acne, growth spurt, menstruation. There are some reports of 5-year-olds shopping for bras, but that's way, way outside the norm. Those are, we'll talk about that in a little while, but those are for very different reasons. Those aren't just on the early side of the normal curve. Those are way out there. An additionally interesting and potentially critical fact that we have also found is that breast development, meaning the onset of puberty, is significantly earlier than in the 1970s. But in general, menarche isn't much sooner. So menarche has gone only from 12 years, 9 months to 12 years, 6 months since the 70s. So there has been an earlier onset, but nowhere near as early an onset as breast development. And we will see that there are actually some potential causes of early puberty that would disproportionately influence breast development as opposed to menstruation. So let's get back to the kinds of early development. 2 overall types. The first is called central precocious puberty. So central precocious puberty, or CPP, is good enough for me. That's when puberty begins due to a defect in the nervous system. There's something going on that, biologically, that is not because of the typical causes or the typical early spurs. This is just completely different. The other one is just being on the early side of the normal curve. Hopefully you've taken stats, but if not, the normal curve, the bell curve, just shows that some people start things earlier than others, even earlier than averages. And people who are on the early side of the normal curve are still considered normal, they're just early. It's like somebody who is 5'1". They would be shorter than average, but not unusually short. Central precocious puberty would be like if somebody was 2 feet tall. It's really unusually early. Okay, so what are the 3 potential main causes for the earlier onset of puberty? Well, the first one is obesity, basically excess fat. We know that obesity has tripled in the past 30 years, so now about 20% of adolescents are obese, and the timing is perfect for this increasingly lower age of puberty. And menstruation is actually more correlated with body size than age, which makes sense evolutionarily, right? That it doesn't matter if you are old or young, if you are not having enough food to be thick, then it doesn't make sense for your body to try to make another child. It doesn't make sense for it to try to get pregnant if you don't have enough food for yourself. That's the evolutionary argument on this, which is why it doesn't matter, again, how old you are, and why menstruation is more correlated with body size, weight, than it is with age. And it's not even weight as much as it is body fat. So 2 girls who are the same weight, but one who has a higher percentage of fat, is more likely to go through puberty early. So it seems in particular not just weight, but fat. Now, we cannot do experiments on this ethically. We cannot randomly assign, get 500 girls, take 250 of them, and cause them to get obese. We can't do that ethically to have a true experiment. But we have done it on animals, and all studies support this link. One study actually found that for every point of BMI, the age of menarche dropped about a month. And there is some evidence that weight at age 4 can predict pubertal weight and chance of early puberty. One of the reasons for this increase could be that obesity causes increases in leptin. It's Leptin. And leptin is a hormone that helps with appetite suppression. Helps you say, hey, I'm full. Now, when fat cells in your body are filled up, they secrete leptin, and this helps you stop eating. Now, since leptin is produced by fat, higher levels of leptin are found in obese people, and their bodies don't respond to it normally, which is why you can't just take pills of leptin and then have yourself not, as a forced diet. People thought originally when they discovered leptin that you could just take a leptin pill and that would keep people from overeating, but it's actually not that way. It's kind of the opposite. So leptin levels naturally rise right before puberty and seem to help it start earlier. And so we think this could be the way that obesity does it. Studies of mice born without the ability to produce leptin shows that they become obese, but they actually do not go through puberty. And this is true also with people who are born without the ability to produce leptin. They don't go through puberty and become obese. On the opposite end of the spectrum for weight, we know that very thin girls can postpone puberty. Now, while all of this is true so far, we know that this is not the whole story. People with healthy weights also go through puberty earlier than girls in the past. So it can't only be obesity. It can be a factor, but it's not just obesity. So let's move on to chemicals, the second potential cause. Exposure to chemicals begins in the womb. Being exposed to chemicals that could influence puberty begins while you are in the womb. And because of that, we are at a methodological impasse because it's impossible to tell what chemicals have hit people through the years of their life. Is it important that a chemical hits you before you're born? Is it important if it gets to you at age 4 or 6? When is the critical period here? And compounding things is the fact that fetuses and babies don't have immune systems that are developed enough to fight off things like adults do. Now, while there are some naturally occurring chemicals in the world, there's also a ton of synthetic ones. This book found that there are traces. It found traces of 232 synthetic chemicals alone in the umbilical cord blood of infants at birth. It means you're born, they take a sample of the blood from the umbilical cord, have found 232 synthetic chemicals. That's amazing. There are also another 800 either known or suspected chemicals that are thought to possibly be capable of interfering with your hormone system or your endocrine system. Those are one and the same in some way. Additionally, the authors of this book say that every time that they have been asked to look for another potential chemical in blood, everyone they've ever tested for, they've found, including ones that were banned years ago, literally banned, because they are what's called bioaccumulative, meaning that if they get into your fat cells, they just stay there. Your body doesn't process it out like it does alcohol. You don't have a liver to take these chemicals out of your body, so they just kind of stay there and can stay there for years and years and years. They can stay in waterways, they can stay in the air for long periods of time. Only a fraction of them have been studied as for their potentials as endocrine disruptors. Again, endocrine system, hormone system, one and the same. Only a fraction of them have been studied as potential disruptors in animals, much less in humans. And therefore, the vast majority of chemicals in use today haven't been looked at in relation to human health. Therefore, we have no idea what the hell they do. And while we're talking about this with puberty, this has implications for things like cancer, or what about autism? Maybe, well, we know that it's not vaccinations causing autism. Maybe the rise in autism could be caused by the rise in all of these synthetic chemicals that are in everything that we eat, drink, smell, everything. Common chemicals that are looked at as potential endocrine disruptors include flame retardants, substances in plastics like BPA, which was banned in sippy cups and bottles in 2012, but only in sippy cups and bottles. If you get a receipt that has like a waxy film on it, that's BPA. That is an endocrine disruptor. Pesticides, detergents, tobaccos, heavy metals, all of these things are possible endocrine disruptors. Some of these chemicals act, and we know this, that they act by locking onto estrogen receptors in the body that mimic the effects of estrogen, and that's what we're concerned about. If it is a chemical that might be hormone, but it doesn't actually lock into estrogen receptors, then it probably is not as big of a deal. But the ones that mimic estrogen are the ones we are really concerned about. And breast development is actually more sensitive to estrogen than menstruation. If you remember, I mentioned earlier, breast development is getting earlier and earlier, faster than menstruation is. So breast development being more sensitive to estrogen than menstruation might be why we are getting breast development earlier, but menstruation isn't really getting that much earlier. And increasing this problem is that some of the chemicals that we are taking might actually enhance fat tissue, which releases estrogen and leptin. So it could be even more cyclical. And even more to the problem is that there might be sensitive periods for certain chemicals, like we talked about earlier, but we don't know it. There could also be interactive effects, meaning one chemical, we could test it on animals in one way and it does X, and we test another chemical and it does Y. But if we don't test chemical X plus chemical Y, we might not see that Z happens, and Z might be really, really bad. And we do know that many of these chemicals, most of them were created following World War II, so it would make some sense that these could be causing the spikes that we've seen since then. However, to be fair, there have been a lot of changes other than that since World War II. So let's look at some of the potential chemical causes in more detail. Some of the ones people have hypothesized could be problems. And I should say before we get into this that I'm only talking about these things as problems for puberty. All of these things could have other problems. I'm not debating that. But what are the ones that are potentially responsible for changes in puberty? Okay, so let's start with soy. Some people have said that soy could mimic female hormones, and soy is in many of the things that we eat. However, soy is natural, so it seems relatively okay. And there are actually plant estrogens that bond to human estrogens, but they're not the true hormone mimickers that we've said are problems. So if anything, they would have a weak effect. And there's some evidence that soy might actually be able to protect girls from developing early puberty. And the theory goes that exposure to natural soy that has these weak estrogenic effects might actually make the body less sensitive to estrogen receptors, and therefore estrogen later in life. Now, one confounding issue with soy is that people who eat more soy tend to have healthier diets in general. Soy is the main ingredient in tofu and tempeh, a lot of vegetarian replacements. So if you eat well, people who eat more tofu and tempeh tend to eat better. So it could be that it's more overall diet than it is just soy. But nonetheless, soy doesn't seem to be the big problem. What about hormones in dairy and meat? Well, some substances in milk have weak estrogenic effects, not anything major. But hormones, bovine hormones given to cows, we know don't do anything because growth hormone doesn't do anything for puberty. It might do other bad stuff, but again, not puberty. And many of the other naturally occurring hormones in meat and breast milk break down in our stomachs relatively quickly and relatively easily. So while hormones in dairy and meat might not be a good thing in other ways, again, it doesn't seem for puberty that they are the big problem. Next up, xenoestrogens, and that's Xeno estrogens. Xenoestrogens. Xenoestrogens. These are the real problems. Just spoiler alert. These are chemicals that actually act like hormones once they are ingested. Now, they are not necessarily hormones themselves, but they are similar enough that they bind to hormone receptors and cause reactions that are similar to them. And these are in things like antibiotics, BPA, tobacco, flame retardants, pesticides, and even some natural natural products, quote unquote, natural products like tea tree oil and lavender oil actually are potential xenoestrogens and aren't recommended for young children. So you might go to a natural food store and say, hey, let me get some tea tree oil for my child. Well, you actually might be hurting them in a way by giving them some kind of tea tree oil supplement or smearing it on their chest. They could be getting the similar effects that other xenoestrogens are. Now, because we lack the ability to do true experiments on the effects of these xenoestrogens, we look for accidents. So I'll give you two examples. In 1973 in Michigan, cattle were fed grain that accidentally had flame retardants that were estrogen mimickers. And girls who were born to these pregnant women who consumed products from these cows started menstruating on average 1 year earlier than their peers. Pretty good evidence. In the 1980s in Puerto Rico, they don't have the exact numbers on this because it was not as carefully taken track of as in Michigan, but we know that mothers who consumed milk with higher levels of plasticizers that mimic estrogen, there was also a epidemic of early puberty, this time in both boys and girls. So let's talk about these xenoestrogens a little bit more, and specifically in your homes, because they're everywhere, but you might think, oh, they're probably not in my homes. Well, it is. Pesticides, industrial chemicals, cosmetics. If you have anything that smells good, any kind of perfume, probably in there. Toiletries, plastics can be xenoestrogens. And because of that, these things often find their way into the water supply, and they don't break down in the body. This is what referred to as earlier as bioaccumulative. This just means it's stored in the fat of animals, and it stays there. It's not filtered out. And so there's more and more in it, increasing amounts as you go up the food chain, which can then get into our bodies. This is why some people have concerns about how much fish people should eat, especially pregnant women should eat, because the levels of mercury get higher and higher as tuna, for example, eat smaller fish. It can also accumulate in soil and in underwater sediments where small organisms live, and then those small organisms get ingested and then on up the chain. And many of these things are actually discharged legally, which is scary, and so it's super hard to deal with. This is one place where it is definite, it's 100% sure that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, needs more funding. There are things we know are not good that are getting put into the environment that can hurt us. This is not a potential thing, but the EPA has turned into this unnecessarily political football. Now, some of these things aren't necessarily that bad. Some have short half-lives. However, they are ubiquitous. They are in plastic toys, food, cleaning supplies, non-stick pans. That non-stick substance likely has it in there. And every time that a little girl plays dress up and puts on perfume, they are exposed, at least in all likelihood. And part of this is a problem because it's really hard to buy fragrance-free products. My wife and I, we have to go to natural food stores to buy laundry detergent that does not have a fragrance in it, which is amazing. So let's get a little bit more specific here and just talk quickly about BPA. BPA, you guys have probably heard of. There was this big thing that BPA has been phased out of bottles. And not only that, but also like plastic bottles for drinking. But 93% of Americans have traces of BPA in their blood. 93%. And you say, oh, it might not be that bad. Well, BPA was created in 1891. And it was created as, wait for it, a synthetic estrogen. Not a joke. BPA was created as a synthetic estrogen. And it was used in humans and animals for the first half of the 1900s, until it was banned, but only from medical use when it was found to be a carcinogen. This is also, by the way, this is not in dispute even by the people who make BPA. Everybody knows this. Well, everybody admits to it. They don't want it to be told. In the 1950s, Bayer and GE discovered it was a good plasticizer, meaning it helped with plastics. It could be hard enough to replace steel, it could be clear enough to replace glass, and it got put everywhere then, in electronics, food containers, safety equipment, dental sealants, even in, as I mentioned earlier, cash register receipts. It's actually probably, well, many people say it's a bad idea to recycle cash register receipts because that means the BPA just gets put back into things. And while BPA is a problem, some people said, oh, we've got it out of water bottles. Well, they've only got rid of BPA. Many people believe that the chemicals that they have put in water bottles to do the similar thing, but not be exactly BPA, might be even worse than BPA. And this is just one chemical. One. And there are literally thousands of them out there. So this is not, I don't want to try to stoke unnecessary fear, but it's something that people should understand. And then the last one, this one is brief, stress. We know that stress can increase the speed of sexuality. We talk about this with life history theory when we talk about parenting. Well, this is true for puberty as well. Children who have higher physiological sensitivity to stress tend to begin puberty earlier if they have poor family relationships. And similarly, other things like an absence of a father, living with a depressed mother, early childhood trauma, such as sexual abuse, can increase the onset of puberty. One estimate is that girls who grow up without a father are actually 2 times more likely to go through puberty early. However, we also have to admit that these effects could be because of factors related to socioeconomic status. We know that chemical exposure in low SES people is higher, and so it could be that people who are in these situations actually are not going through puberty early because of stress, but stress causes all of these potential other issues. Okay, so let's move on now to mistimed puberty. In general, we think that in early maturation, I'm sorry, these pictures ended up on top of each other. Okay, that's better. Early maturation. For boys, early maturation seems to be, relatively speaking, a plus. They tend to be more successful athletically, they're more popular, have higher self-esteem, but there can be bad things. They are also more likely to have difficulties in school, more likely to get involved in delinquency and substance abuse. But in general, it seems that the pros, relatively speaking, outweigh the cons. For girls, it might be more negative. They might be made to feel uncomfortable, especially in front of friends who haven't gone through it, and they can endure some ridicule from it. There's a really good South Park episode called Bebe's Boobs Destroy Society that hits on this. It can be good in some ways. These girls might be sought out after as dates more, but on the other hand, they might not be ready for it. And especially that attempts at being sexy can be viewed negatively in young girls. However, in countries with more liberal sexual attitudes, it can be a particularly positive thing. But another thing that I want to emphasize is throughout this class, and you'll probably see it, is that we spend so much time talking about differences across groups. So Americans are different than Chinese people. Well, there's a lot of difference within cultures as well. So if you have a different peer group than a peer group with more liberal sexual attitudes, it can be more positive as well. And then late maturation, the opposite of early maturation, tends to be worse for boys. They tend to be thought of as less physically attractive, disadvantaged athletically, disadvantaged romantically, since boys are, quote, supposed to be taller than girls. And on the other hand, girls might be overlooked for as dates, but there's actually some research that shows that girls are who go through puberty later have higher satisfaction with their changes, have more positive relationships, have fewer emotional problems as well. So it's definitely more of a good thing for boys. A good thing for girls to be late than early. But it's there are some pros and cons.